Hello again. It is time now to move to our interpretation of Aristophanes' Frogs. Now, before you watch this mini video, please watch video part 2, which is on comedy's paradoxical obsession with tragedy, and in general on comedy as something much more than political satire.
First, a few words on this play. It was produced for the first time in 405 BC, so it was a mature play in Aristophanes' career, which had started in the early 420s. It was also awarded first prize at its first production. The political situation in Athens at the time of the production of Frogs is also important to look at, because Frogs is a topical play like most old comedy. So this play was produced during an ongoing war against Spartans, which has now by this time been going on and off for 25 years. Significant events which you should know are Athens' military disaster of 413 BC and the short-lived oligarchic coup, so overthrow of democracy, short-lived, of 411 BC. The change of the terms of the war since the Spartans, after this time, are receiving support from Persia's vast wealth, something that certainly tips the balance. And the war, as you know probably, was going to be lost in 404 to the Spartans. Now, although we're making reference to this historical and political background, we should also know that the play is not directly about politics, but about poetry and its role in society, and specifically about tragic poetry, tragedy. More specifically, there is a direct association of two situations that are prevalent in the Aristophanic imagination in the Frogs. One, the decline of Athens as polis, largely due to its military and financial circumstances. And second, the decline of tragedy as genre. And here is where, what we hear first in the beginning of the play about the recent deaths of Sophocles and Euripides in 406 makes sense. The setting of the play is mobile, and specifically it is a journey from Athens to the underworld. And in fact, half of the play takes place in the underworld. So with this background in mind, let's look at the play's plot and its static action. Dionysus, the god of intoxication, transformation, and theatre, is the main character of this play. He appears hugely frustrated by the lack of good tragic poets in Athens. Sophocles and Euripides have just died in the previous year, as we said. Dionysus decides to travel to the underworld to bring back his beloved Euripides. Here is an excerpt from his dialogue with Heracles, whom Dionysus goes to consult because Heracles has been to the underworld before. So this is lines 66 to 73. So this is what Dionysus says to Heracles. Well, that's the kind of longing that's eating away at me for Euripides. Heracles, you mean dead and all? Dionysus, and nobody on earth can persuade me not to go after him. Heracles, even below to Hades? Dionysus, by heaven, even if there is somewhere below that. Heracles, what is it that you want? Dionysus, I need a talented poet, for some are gone and those that live are bad. This is a direct quotation from Euripides. Heracles, how so? Isn't Iphone alive? The dialogue continues with Heracles suggesting many names of poets who are still alive, but who Dionysus keeps rejected as untalented, in his opinion. Heracles, aren't there others here? lads by the thousands composing tragedies and out-blubbering Euripides by a mile? Dionysus, those are cast-offs and empty chatter, choirs of swallows, wreckers of their art, who are given a chorus by the polished ones, but are soon forgotten after their single piece at Lady Tragedy. But if you look for a fertile or a potent, the Greek word is gonemon poet, one who could utter a lordly phrase, you won't find any left. And here comes the crucial key question from Heracles. What do you mean fertile, potent? What do you mean gonemon? And Dionysus says gonemon as in one who can give voice to something adventuresome, like ether bedchamber of Zeus, or time's foot, or a heart unwilling to swear upon sacrificial victims, and a tongue forsworn separately from the heart. All of these, again, are quotations from actual Euripidean plays. Now, all of these quotations and the way that Dionysus presents them give us an understanding of what the god Dionysus here perceives as talent or artistic fertility, artistic potency. For Dionysus, who has been nourished in the last few decades by the modern art of Euripides, talent is experimentation with tragic language and craftiness with unconventional use of words, doing something modern, doing something adventuresome. We will see why this is important. So the first part of the play goes on like this, as Dionysus descends into the underworld to achieve his objective, which is, as we saw, to provide a solution to Athens' cultural sterility, very vividly explained by the god of the theatre in the beginning of the play. And how is he going to do that? Dionysus explains to us that he wants to resurrect Athens' past fortunes from the land of the dead, hence the reason that he goes to the underworld. And these past fortunes are embodied, as Dionysus thinks in the beginning of the play, by the adventuresome, experimental, craftsman of words, innovative and exciting poet Euripides. Now going to the second part of the play, Euripides enters a poetic contest with a master tragic poet of the older generation, Aeschylus. This is the scene that he encounters in the underworld. So from going to the underworld to retrieve Euripides, the new objective now is to judge the contest between Euripides and Aeschylus, and to determine who is the best, that is, the most fertile tragic poet, and as a result, bring him up to Athens to save it. In the second part of the play, the poetic contest between Euripides and Aeschylus is probably the most famous part of the Frogs. But it is so much based on quotations and direct literary criticism that some readers and viewers who are unfamiliar with Euripidean and Aeschylean tragedy become put off or confused. But see, and I will try to make it easier for us to engage with this brilliant scene by pointing to this key, okay, the fact that the two poets are constructed through imagery, but imagery which captures that captures the way their poetic style is perceived by audiences at this point in time. So, on one hand, Euripides, using this imagery, which I have here translated through these kind of, I hope, quite evocative images that I got from Google, Euripides is portrayed as the poet of clever craft, an adventurous use of language. And in comedy, which loves physicality and wants to portray things in physical rather than abstract ways, craft is turned into kind of a Bob the Builder building, cutting, shaving, and drilling actions, okay, as well as instruments. Instruments play a big role in the portrayal of Euripides in comedy. Euripides also is portrayed as the poet whose poetry deals with issues closer to everyday life, and also the poet who mesmerizes the audiences, but that is the masses, not the elite. He is also subversive of tradition, so kind of the feel of danger is, very often surrounding the portrayal of Euripides. Now, on the other hand, Aeschylus is presented by Aristophanes as the poet of raw power. Okay? Even his anger is the anger of an earth-born monster. So the poet of raw power, but as well as natural inspiration, whose poetry, whose language flows like a powerful stream of water, not like this crafty cutting, thing of Euripides. And also that has the weight of Homeric epic. Homeric images are everywhere in the Aristophanic Aeschylus's poetry. Chariots, heavy weaponry, boulders, horses, and corpses are some of the images found in the construction of Aeschylus's poetic style. Aeschylus's poetry is also shown to be dealing only with noble themes and to be concealing morally reprehensible aspects of life, as opposed to Euripidean poetry, which in the Aristophanic representation, is shown to relish them and showing them uncensored. Aeschylean poetry is also shown to be the poetry that upholds tradition and appeals to the few but noble. Now, let's have a look at passages to understand comedy's rich imagination in portraying these poets and how comedy engages with the popular perception of these poets and their style. Now, the best example for this is the song of the chorus that introduces us for the first time to the poetic contest in the underworld, which is about to take place as soon as the god Dionysus has reached the underworld. Now, as I read it, please note that the yellowish font here refers to Aeschylus, whereas the green thinner one to Euripides. Okay. Now, this is a song sung, by the chorus. Surely fearful wrath will fill the heart of the mighty thunderer when he sees the sharp talking tusk of his rival in art being whetted, and then with fearful fury will his eyes whirl about. We'll have helmet-glinting struggles of tall-crested wards, okay, epic images. And then we have linchpin shavings and chisel pairings of artworks as a man fends off a thought-building hero's galloping utterances. And this is now pure Aeschylus the next, bristling the shaggy-necked shock of his hirsute ridge of mane, his formidable brow frowning. With a roar he will hurl utterances bolted together, tearing off timbers with his earth-born blast. And then the smooth-tongued, unfurling, mouth-working tester of words, sleeping the reins of envy, will sort out those utterances and parse clean away much labour of lungs. Now, I will analyze this imagery and how it is key for us to understand the outcome of frogs much more extensively in my 25th of January talk. For now, let us look at another binary presentation of the two poets in the same poetic contest, this time on their attitudes to religion and how this maps them to all the new traditional and modern or conventional and subversive. this is now what Dionysus says to the two poets. Now, each one of you say a prayer before you recite your poetry. Aeschylus goes first. Demeter, who nourished my mind, may I be worthy of your mysteries. And then Dionysus turns to Euripides. You take some incense too and put it on the fire. Euripides, no thanks. The gods I pray to are different. Dionysus, what? Some private gods of your own? A novel coinage? See, kind of the making, the crafting imagery here. Okay, then go ahead and pray to these unofficial gods. Euripides, sky my nourisher and pivot of tongue and smarts and keen nostrils, may I correctly refute any arguments I get hold of. As you can see, once again Euripides, or his comic counterpart, is tied to experimentation, innovation, and subversion, whereas Aeschylus sticks with tradition as well as mystic cult, which is a cult that has nature and its life-giving energies at its heart. One final example that explores the relationship of the poets with their audiences is here. Aeschylean tragedy and Aeschylus himself are presented here as lofty, okay, indulging in difficult and incomprehensible language, much of it taken from the world of epic. Whereas Euripidean poetry, which is democratic and close to its audiences, is presented as having put the heavy tragic language that it inherited from Aeschylus on a diet and making everything much more audience-friendly. So let's see, Euripides. This is Euripides now talking about Aeschylus during the contest. And then when he had humbugged along like that and the play was half over, he would come out with a dozen words as big as an ox, with crests and beetling brows, formidable boogie-faced things unfamiliar with the spectators. And he wouldn't say a single intelligible word. It seems that Aeschylus here is gnashing his teeth, kind of this, kind of with his animal kind of raw power and his anger that he has. So Dionysus turns to him and says, Aeschylus, stop gnashing your teeth. Euripides carries on, but only scamanders or moats or shields bronze bossed and blazoned with griffin eagles and huge craggy utterances that weren't easy to decipher. And after a while, Aeschylus turns to him and says, and what about you? What about you, you enemy of the gods? What sort of things did you write about? And Euripides says, now this is his contrasting representation, certainly not horsecocks or ghost tags like you, the sort of things they embroider on Persian tapestries. No, as soon as I first inherited the art from you, bloated with bombast and obese vocabulary, I immediately put it on a diet and took off the weight with a regimen of wordlets and strolls and wild little beats, administering chatter juice pressed from books. And then I built up its strength with an admixture of Cephisophone's areas. And I didn't write any old humbug that came into my head or charge in and make a mess. But the very first character who walked on my stage started by explaining the origins of the play. There are plenty of other passages which create a brilliant contrast between the two poetic styles, with much exaggeration and distortion, as we will see, for the sake of the binary argument. But how does understanding this binary opposition help us understand the play? Now, because, as many of you know, Dionysus, despite his intentions in the beginning of the play, does not choose Euripides to revive after all. He chooses Aeschylus. And how should we read this decision, and what does this mean for Aristophanic comedy? Now, to find out, I suggest you come to our production of Frogs on the 25th of January 2019. But for those of you who are not coming, we will also upload the talk on the website within 2 weeks. So do not worry if you're not coming. Until then, I think we can make a conclusion. What can we take from this first contact with Aristophanes' comedy Frogs? Firstly, comedy bears a huge responsibility for our preconceptions about Greek tragedy. It is to comedy that we owe the impression that Aeschylean tragedy was grand but primitive. I mean, such things were still taught to us. I mean, for example, when I was a child at school. So grand but primitive, epic but difficult, and that Euripides, his subversiveness and his experimentations were responsible for the gradual degeneration of the tragic genre. And a preconception perpetuated by comedy and ossified by Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy, but far from true. Greek comedy, secondly, a richly imaginative genre with its finger on the pulse of its own time, but also a distorting mirror, an indulgent perpetuator of popular ideas and stereotypes, had an enormous influence in the afterlife of tragedy, as it also had for the perception of a lot of other things in the 5th century, from politics to art and from social values to historical events. And all this was part of its own self-definition and its function in society as a genre and its competitive attitudes toward other genres. But to hear more on this, come in January. Thank you.